Good afternoon, and I'm glad to see so many people here from all around the world. I'm Ira Selkowitz, the director of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program at the University of Colorado Denver Business School. And along with Melanie Kay, the director of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative at the University of Colorado School of Law, we are pleased to welcome you to Why They Do It, Inside the Mind of the White-Collar Criminal. Our speaker is Eugene Soltes, professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School, and the title of our program is ethically taken, I might add, from his best-selling book of the same name. Our co-sponsors are the Center for Bioethics and Humanities on the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, the School of Public Affairs of the University of Colorado Denver, and the Colorado chapter of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which is providing the CPE Continuing Education Ethics credit for this program. The namesake of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program is Bill Daniels. Bill Daniels was a pioneer in the cable television industry, as well as an owner of sports teams. Bill's success in business was due in no small part to his ethical business practices based on 8 principles. These principles are integrity, trust, accountability, transparency, respect, fairness, adherence to the rule of law, and creating long-term value for all relevant stakeholders. When Bill passed away, his estate went to the Daniels Fund, a private charitable foundation that he had established. One of the programs of the foundation is the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program, which provides grants to instill principle-based ethics education at the collegiate level in a 4-state region of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. The collegiate program is comprised of 11 business schools in this 4-state region, plus the University of Colorado School of Law, which is known as Colorado Law. A major goal of the Ethics Initiative is outreach to the business community. This program that you're at today is an example of just such outreach, and we are pleased to have attendees from all over the U.S. and even internationally. I have just a few administrative matters before we begin. Please note that we are recording this program, and the recording will be uploaded to YouTube within the next few weeks. All registrants to the program will receive a link to the recording. For any tech-related questions, please use the chat button on your screen. The chat button is what you would use for tech-related questions. Please use the Q&A button on your screen to ask questions of Professor Soltis. I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the program, and we will get to as many questions as we can in the last 15 minutes of the program. And now I would like to introduce Professor Melanie Kay of Colorado Law, who will lead the discussion with Professor Soltis. Ms. Kay is a faculty instructor who joined the University of Colorado Law School in 2015 as the director of Colorado Law's Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program. The Ethics Initiative at Colorado Law focuses on helping law students develop strong, principled, ethical, and professional identities through courses, experiential programming, and other hands-on opportunities. She is also a co-director of Colorado Law's Master of Studies of Law, MSL, in the Ethics and Compliance degree program. Professor Kay teaches a variety of legal ethics and ethical culture courses to both JD and MSL students at the law school. Professor Kay came to Colorado Law after 10 years of litigation experience. She primarily practiced environmental law with the nonprofit public interest law firm Earth Justice in Denver, Colorado. She also practiced general civil litigation at Latham and Watkins in San Francisco and Wheeler Trigg O'Donnell in Denver. Immediately after law school, she clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for the Honorable Proctor Hugg Jr. in Reno, Nevada. Professor Kay earned her JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, her MS in Environmental Geochemistry from the University of Montana, and her AB in Earth Sciences from Dartmouth College. Welcome to Why They Do It, Inside the Mind of the White-Collar Criminal. Thank you very much and enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Ira, and thank you to all of you for being here today. We are just thrilled to see how many of you joined us for this great discussion with Professor Soltis, and it's such a thrill to see all of the places that you're coming from. I think they were going by so quickly, but I think I saw Kiev, I saw Chile, I saw Portugal, And I saw my own dad from York, Pennsylvania. So welcome everyone, and we're so grateful to have you all joining us today. So I am thrilled and honored to be able to introduce Professor Eugene Soltes here joining us today. Professor Soltis is a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, where his work focuses on corporate integrity and risk management. His research utilizes data analytics to identify organizational cultures and compliance systems that can effectively prevent, detect, and respond to reputational and regulatory threats. Professor Soltis teaches graduate level courses on regulatory environments and risk management, and was the recipient of the Charles M. Williams Award for Outstanding Teaching. He frequently serves as an advisor and consultant to multinational corporations regarding the design of their compliance programs, and is routinely invited to speak to regulators, including the Department of Justice, Securities and Exchange Commission, and the United States Treasury. Drawing on his experience with companies and government agencies, Professor Soltis founded Integrity Lab, which creates integrated data-driven technology to cultivate organizational integrity and strengthen corporate culture. Professor Soltis is the author of the best-selling book, Why They Do It, Inside the Mind of the White-Collar Criminal, which was described by Kirkus Reviews as a groundbreaking study on white-collar criminality. Based on years of research and hundreds of hours of interviews, the book refutes popular explanations of why seemingly successful managers engage in misconduct by showing that many make decisions on the basis of intuitions and gut feelings. The trouble, Professor Soltis shows, is that these gut feelings are often poorly suited for the modern business world. Prior to joining the faculty of Harvard Business School, Professor Soltis received his PhD and MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and his AM in Statistics and AB in Economics from Harvard University. Welcome, Professor Soltis.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are.
So we are going to be spending a lot of time today discussing Professor Soltis's book, but rest assured, those of you who have not had the opportunity to read it yet, we will make sure the content is accessible for everyone. But that said, I highly recommend the book. As I told Professor Soltis, I found it to be an absolute page turner. So I'd like to dive in a bit to the book and some of the concepts you cover there. So before we do that, I'd like to first know what inspired you to write Why They Do It.
This was a project that wasn't started like other academic projects. It started with the same personal curiosity I expect everyone else on this webinar tonight has about the same topic, which is you are hearing about these stories in the Wall Street Journal or on the radio, watching a TV show, maybe American Greed one night, and you're seeing these people that were once stars. Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos, one of the more recent examples. I mean, one of the youngest female billionaires, an inspiring individual by all accounts. And then a couple years later, it turns out to be a fraud. And prompted by those same questions. So in my particular instance, it started while I was still a graduate student, up late one night working on my regressions, as any good doctoral student is doing at 3 in the morning. And this is still the day where you had to flip through the TV channels to find something to watch. And I came across a show on MSNBC called Lockup. It's still on, certainly if you have Netflix, you can see it, where they send a camera crew to prisons around the country. And they're interviewing people who've engaged in generally violent offenses, murder, assault, other things of that nature. And while I was watching this show, this was right after Bernie Madoff had been arrested. Enron was still very much in the news. I was wondering if I had 30 minutes with one of these guys, like the people on the show had when they were speaking with them, what would they say? How would they explain their actions? And so that night, this is not a research project, personal curiosity. I just wrote a couple letters. It turns out when you go to federal prison, it's your address is oddly accessible. There's a very nice online database. You can look up their address, and sent the first 10 questions that came to the top of my mind. And it's that night, started to get a couple letters a few months later that really started this entire line of work and research.
I think that's so interesting that it really was just this curiosity and then just firing off some emails and letters and wondering if they would talk to you. And it turns out they did. So upon getting to know some of these, white collar criminals who are sitting in prison, why did you start to feel that theirs was an important story to tell? What did you find valuable in the narratives that you were hearing?
So I always imagine doing this exercise in my class. And one day when we're back in physical classes, of having a top-notch successful CEO that we all look up to next to one of the CEOs that I was describing in my book, who, was once a high flyer, spent 5 years in prison, and, now is a convicted felon. And having him, or in most cases him, but him or her, give a talk about leadership and integrity. And then at the end of that talk, have people try to guess who is the person that's, the current CEO, and who's the person that's a convicted felon, assuming we didn't know the class didn't know their background. I think people would be hard pressed to actually tell the difference. And I think that's actually saying something that it's very easy to say, us versus them, and to look really down upon these people, because at this point we know some of their actions are things we rightfully frown upon. But really digging into their experiences, it's much more subtle than that. And I think oftentimes when we see these cases hit the front page of the news, it becomes distilled into 500 or 800 words, where there's a lot more to understand about both why things occurred and how these, I'll say invariably, everyone in my book I would describe as a brilliant individual in some different way. How people that reach the pinnacle of their career, you don't reach the head of McKinsey, a managing partner at Deloitte, by not being a strategic, thoughtful individual. So how did they err? And I think that's the part that I'll say, even now, over 10 years later, thinking and studying this topic, I would say I'm just as fascinated, maybe even more so as time goes on, because it's a harder and harder riddle to try to solve.
Yeah, and I think your book does such an excellent job of that, of pointing out how, and we'll get to this, I think, later in the discussion, about how these were not typically like the criminal masterminds who went in with the intent, to rob and steal. And that makes it a much more interesting investigation, I think, because it's a lot more nuanced and we see a lot more of ourselves in some of them and their personalities. One thing I really appreciated in reading your description of some of these people that you got to know was how remarkably non-judgmental and open-minded you were in your descriptions of these white-collar criminals. And with many of them, you talked over long periods of time. Some of them you were visiting in person. I remember seeing that you had a regular schedule with Bernie Madoff, where you were talking to him every Wednesday night for, I think, 3 years. And through these, engagements, you learned about their personal lives. You heard their side of the story. Did you come away from these relationships, really genuinely liking any of them, or at least feeling empathy towards their thought processes and how they made their decisions? And I'm curious to know, are there any with whom you are still keeping in touch?
So a great set of questions. So first, I think I'll say empathy is probably a good way of describing. I mean, I got to know them, not just them, but their spouses, their kids, their family. And I mean, it's very easy, I think, for us on the outside to look at someone that gets 6 months in prison or 3 years in prison. It's not that big of a deal. Certainly, if one looks at the current Varsity Blues cases, the college admission scandal, there's been, I think, a lot of criticism that, this person's only going to get 4 months in prison. It does something, I think, psychologically with your relationships to your outside people, how you're being branded. And that's not something I think we ought to trivialize. I mean, I'll say it was tragic to watch. Many people actually see their family kind of go through, stick together. And then I'll say, I've come to appreciate, it's when they leave prison that everything seems to fall apart. I think because the amount of stress of just getting through it keeps everything together. And then when you leave prison, you think things can now, you've paid your dues. I mean, I think that's what we characterize prison. In white collar, especially if you're prominent, that's not. I think that's when actually the real challenge begins, because you realize you're never going to really work again in any substantive matter. That's hard because I think a lot of the people, and I know where we initially connected was, I could talk, some technical finance. Let's dig into some accounting. It's fun for me to even discuss. And they miss that sitting in prison, and I can see they miss that even going forward. And so I'll say that was my way of initially connecting with many individuals, especially when we were talking about things that were uncomfortable. I think my approach with each person was to treat them as an individual, spend a lot of time talking about all the successes they had in their career, And then we'd reach the point where we would then discuss some of the challenges that they faced. I'll say, depending on the individual, it's interesting about who I've kept in touch with and who's kind of fallen off. In some instances, I think people have tried to put this behind in a way. It's not because they're thriving professionally anymore, but I'm also personally now relate to the experience of that person they spent time with in prison talking about all this stuff. And I want to give them the, I don't want to be that fly on the wall that keeps coming back. Some people still want to really dig in and explore, in part because they know I still relate to a lot of people in this area. I'll say personally, I've taken a lot of humility away, even thinking about the decisions that I make and others make, things that we normally don't think a lot of, speeding and how that's something so easily to trivialize, but in their world, what they were doing, I don't think in many of their instances felt that different to them at the time. So that's how I view it. Is there is a degree of empathy, strong empathy.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially being in kind of having the same intellectual interests as a lot of them. And I thought it was interesting you raised the Varsity Blues scandal. Coincidentally, on March 9th, we are having an event with the lead prosecutor from that scandal and some panelists talking about it. And in prepping for that event, I found so many concepts from your book really apply in that scandal. Instead of, leaders of major financial firms, it's college coaches and, stressed out parents. But it was amazing how many of the same concepts that you raise in the book, I could really relate to that scenario. So thinking back to some of these people that you got to know through working on this project, on the less empathetic side, even after facing criminal penalties and financial and reputational ruin, many of the actors in your book seem to still really rationalize their behavior. They see themselves as the victims, or often and very frequently, they are comparing themselves to others who they felt committed far worse misdeeds. So, this guy is like, well, at least I didn't do this thing. And then the person who did that thing, well, at least it wasn't this thing. That's the really bad stuff, and it just kept going. And it was just amazing how often they did that. Did that surprise you? And kind of on the larger notion of accountability, did you see real remorse and understanding, or just this sort of repeat rationalization?
The comparison, I'll say, took a while to get used to, but it also made sense after time. So just so everyone that maybe hasn't looked at the book, so it's this idea that, the people who engage in insider trading would say, well, I know it's a violation, but at least I didn't destroy a firm by engaging in fraud. And then the people who engaged in fraud would say, well, at least I was trying to grow something extraordinary. And, I tried too hard and too aggressively, and that's why it went off the tracks. At least it wasn't a Ponzi scheme. And then the people engaged in Ponzi scheme would admit that maybe they tried something, it just grew out of control and they couldn't handle it, but at least they weren't one of the CEOs of the banks that lost, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. They might have only lost $500 million or $1 billion. And so everyone found some way of saying why there's someone else that's really the villain. I think there's a psychological aspect of trying to place yourself and not see yourself as the bad guy. And that's a way of always finding someone that's, at least in your subjective world, worse. In terms of remorse, I really probed, and because there's a couple people that I'll say, particularly if we get to the later half and talk about Ponzi schemes and Bernie Madoff in particular, I would say are harder cases to say, like, you don't have remorse. This isn't like a technical, we could talk about Varsity Blues or some kind of technical insider trading area that's quite nuanced. These are pretty, we'll call it blatant, large scale, over many years, fraudulent activities. Not a slight of a kind of a deviation that occurred once at some point in time. And I'll say, I don't know what to say for that. I really tried to understand that. The remorse came from, missing their family's birthdays, their kid's birthday, their graduation. And I think there was a deep sense of remorse. I learned writing this book, actually, I both got married and had my first child all during this project. And it was interesting to watch what some of them would say when I would mention I was going to miss our conversation. Remember, I was going on my honeymoon, so I was canceling all my conversations. And how many wanted to give, and actually wrote some very heartfelt advice about, congratulations on getting married, congratulations. because they now saw themselves as this is their chance to be the great dad or the great husband that they never were when they were that type A personality. And so I think that's a way of trying to reposition that I still can redeem myself in some other way.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And it strikes me, you know, not seeing yourself as a villain. There's an element of self-preservation there, because, you know, if you do, and, you know, truly, really deeply think about the impacts of your behavior, it's a really hard thing to come back from, I think. And, you know, so, you know, stopping at the more immediate level maybe there is some element of self-protection there.
People adjust it. I'll say the thing that surprised me most is how well people adjust to different circumstances. I mean, you know, I'll say, not to say anyone I think on this webinar would fare well if they were thrown into a prison the following week. But we're talking about people that, even by any account, I mean, they were, you know, they had access to private jets. They lived, let's say, very, very well, almost invariably. So they went from like one extreme to really the other extreme. And I'll say, visiting people, it's amazing how well people learn to adjust, you know, not the following week, but give yourself a couple months. We all learn to adjust to our surroundings much better than I frankly ever would have anticipated. Which, you know, I think that says something about the type of individual these are, as they learn to adapt and succeed in their own way, whether it's by reading, like becoming very literate and reading everything, double downing on, now several of them would read every book that their child was reading in like their school books and go through their assignments. So if their child actually had like a math question when they would call, they would actually be able to refer to the page. I mean, rather extraordinary ways in which they would try to, I'll say, reinvent themselves in these different settings.
That's fascinating. And like channeling their talents into new, you know, ways to be really good at something.
Totally. I think it's the type A personality. You need to do something well. And if you can't do it in business, I mean, if you're in prison in particular, there's not a lot of options. Put it like that.
Yeah, that is really, really fascinating. Digging a bit more into the psychology behind some of their actions, you spend a lot of time noting traps that really a lot of us can fall into, whether it's overconfidence, a lack of tangible connection or empathy with victims where it just feels too attenuated, a hero or creative genius complex, a slippery slope, rationalization, ethical blind spots, and a lot of, you know, researchers have written extensively on these notions, lack of mindfulness, you know, lack of deliberation and rapid decision-making. On the other hand, we do see a few characters, particularly like a Bernie Madoff, where a deeper psychopathy really seems to be at play. You note that while we all can fall prey to some of these psychological factors, most of us are able to kind of maintain a line and check ourselves before we engage in substantially damaging behavior. So you mentioned speeding, and that's a perfect example where a lot of us, or maybe all of us, do it occasionally, and, you know, we don't feel horribly bad about it. We can rationalize it. We say we'll do better. We do it again. But, you know, most of us would stop before committing corporate fraud. Why do you think some of us are able to stop despite all of these, you know, psychological forces, and others don't?
So if I could succinctly, maybe the thesis of the book is that we all think that knowing the difference between right and wrong is sufficient to stop us from going forward. But I'll say this is where speeding is a very nice analogy, is that we know speeding's wrong, and we all literally see a sign every 2 minutes on the highway. But I'll say, if you're like me, the high speed limit is generally like 55 or 65 on most US roads. And what you do is go like 10 to 15 over. That's kind of what everyone is doing. And I've actually explained to my wife that actually it's keeping up with the traffic is the safe thing to do. It's the slowpoke that's falling behind that actually is the danger. As long as you're going 70 and everyone else is going 70 on the 55, you're in good shape. But I've just rationalized the everyone does it explanation. What we really need is a feeling that something is harmful, and that immediately stops us from even considering an action. So I sometimes think of a different example is, you know, I'm sure I've done some things to drive my neighbors nuts every once in a while, but I'm not particularly worried if I walk outside at night that someone's going to, you know, chase after me with a hatchet for bothering them. Why? Even if there was no law. So imagine we're like that weird movie that they abandon all the laws for one night. I'm sure someone knows what that is. So remember, I watched it late night a couple years ago. Even there was no law against, let's say, murder in the Cambridge, where I live, I'm not worried about any of my neighbors running down the street with a hatchet after me. Why? Reasonably socialized people have an innate feeling that that is harmful, and they wouldn't cause that kind of physical harm to another person. And it's not the law telling them that. There's this innate feeling that they already have, this intuition. The trouble in a lot of corporate contexts where decisions are made is that we're not going to have that same feeling of wrongfulness. In fact, a lot of the laws preventing certain types of conduct are very recent. I mean, bribery, which is something we all describe as pretty egregious. I mean, that until the late 70s, that was not illicit in the United States. Actually, in most of Europe, it wasn't until the late 90s that there was really strong laws against foreign bribery. Insider trading, that was really only in the 1980s that we started creating laws around that. And even if in a lot of other parts of the world, in Europe, those are pretty weakly enforced, civilly at best, and pretty, so the idea that you have this kind of hard, deep intuition against bribery and insider trading and all these nuanced types of crimes strikes me as quite artificial, because ultimately we're just creating these new rules in society that say this is wrong and one not to do it, but that's not like causing physical harm to someone, where we have that innate, deep kind of human nature that prevents us from going forward.
Yeah, I'm seeing lots of comments that the answer to your movie is The Purge. Does that?
Oh, yes, The Purge. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. Thank you, chat room.
I see some good watchers. It's a great movie for a psychological experiment. Although I see what happened in the movie is going a little bit against my example that I've made here, since everyone goes, nuts. But it's not a good horror movie if people don't do that.
I'm glad you brought up this point about how a lot of this behavior and conduct wasn't illegal for a really long time, because that was the foundation for my next question. So as you note, a lot of these behaviors for which these people are in jail were things that were completely legal and accepted for a long time, until very recently, or are really still only a shade or technicality different from still currently legal behavior. Such that many of the rules may start to feel arbitrary. As you noted, some of these crimes don't seem to have a real, true, identifiable victim or quantifiable loss, or in a lot of cases, they didn't bring the criminal himself or herself any personal gain. Is there an element of moral ambiguity here where we are selectively punishing some behaviors, maybe even making examples of people, while others are doing similar things and celebrated for, being these creative problem solvers and having this wonderful business acumen? And a lot of the people who ended up in jail, for the months before, they were hailed as these geniuses, and they were coming up with these new techniques to, make their company more competitive. And so, do you feel that the rule of law and ethics aren't really aligned in this sector? Is it that morals are constantly changing and these people were a little behind the curve? And I'm just thinking in terms of modern attitude towards big corporations. That's changed a lot in terms, as we see wealth disparity grow, and as we see gaining, mistrust of big corporations, are there, sort of those sentiments at play here as well?
There's a lot of also, I'll say, murky conduct that falls between the gray lines of what's illegal and not illegal. And that's where there's, unfortunately, a lot of rewards to be made or a lot of money to be made. So let me give two maybe examples. These are not in the book, but I spend a lot of my time unearthing, I'll say, this murky conduct, because it really probes what the incentives are in human behavior. So let me preface that both of these, let me advise to everyone, you should not do these. This is, I'll say, at best, very, very aggressive, and depending on the right regulator who look at this, they might say that was too aggressive. But let me give two just to probe this. So insider trading, I think most people probably on the webinar tonight recognize that if someone, let's say you have a friend that works at a large tech company and they tell you about a new killer app that's going to make a lot of money, if you then go trade on that information, that's insider trading. You're misappropriating information that's coming from your friend and gaining on that. That's what we call insider trading. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's a loose, we all know that's bad. Don't do that. But let's take a slight twist. Suppose you get that same piece of information from a friend, and let's say it's from tech firm A, and that's going to devastate tech firm B, because this is their main product line. And the second tech firm A releases it, company B is not going to have a sustainable product anymore. So you decide to go short company B. Or let's even be more creative. Let's say you know that stock B is overweighted in some kind of index. So you're not going to trade as what insider trading on company A where you get information, but you're trading on, let's say, some ETF that happens to be highly correlated with that inside information that you received. What I like to call a highly correlated stock substitute. That's exceptionally hard, if not impossible, for regulators to be putting that information together. Conceptually, intuitively, that's exactly what insider trading is about. You're misappropriating information and gaining on it, but it's one that would be exceptionally hard to enforce against, and one that it kind of, I call, falls in that gray nebulous zone that you're doing the same thing, you can make a lot of money on it, but probably wouldn't be enforced in the same way. I'll give one other one, is that bribery. Again, you should not bribe foreign officials. We have very strong laws like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States, which are strongly enforced. What I've discovered in some countries abroad, one popular strategy to circumvent this has been giving gifts to ministers that let's say might be worth a couple $100, something you can record on your books and records, and then suggesting that if they happen to sell that in an auction house, let's say a year later, the company might buy that back. And let's say now you buy it back for $50,000. Again, arm's length transactions actually through an auction house. You've now transferred $49,900 to the minister. You're bribing. That is a bribe. This is why we have the FCPA and a variety of other laws. I'll say those are two examples. I could spend the next like 12 hours giving hundreds of these. Hopefully those examples, no one's getting too excited and didn't do any of those, but I would say hopefully cause you to pause for a second and say, you're right, that's the exact same thing as this people that are going to prison for bribing a minister, that art idea, but this is just a more clever, or it's a more circuitous way to restructure that transaction that seemingly would avoid the penalties. And I see these, I'll say, all around, and what's maybe scary is the smarter the individuals, the better they are coming up with those ideas and seeing the rewards associated with them. And so how do we actually match I'll say the law, which is how most people, or a lot of people, guide their conduct, match with what I think of as integrity, which is just because we don't have a law against stock substitutes, that insider trading example, doesn't mean that's a great idea to do.
Yeah. I think that gray area is where things get so difficult, and even people who, are trying to do the right thing and generally, guided by principles of ethics that they, would say they hold dearly. It's that fine line between, wanting to do the right thing and then seeing a brilliant creative opportunity. And for these types who pride themselves on problem solving and finding answers to solutions to difficult problems, this is right up their alley. And so it becomes a much tougher question of, am I staying in line with those principles, or am I violating them by trying to solve that problem in this particular way? One of the things that struck me in reading your book, and it kept coming up for me, was thinking about this fraud triangle concept, and the notion of if there's pressure and if there's opportunity and a rationale, it's the secret sauce for fraud, right? And I noticed that a lot of the crimes that are described in your book struck me where the pressure was coming from this intense short-termerism, where we have these quarterly reporting deadlines, and you're somehow supposed to miraculously show that you're crushing it every single time without fail. When we're trying to jam in these sales, before the quarter closes and get the numbers on the books by a certain arbitrary date. And so it doesn't feel so bad to backdate, or, things like that. Do you agree that a lot of this is coming from that short-termism, kind of pressure? And if so, do you hear any talk of prioritizing or incentivizing, more viability in the long term, like thinking more long term, having, encouraging people to be a little bit more patient at times, and look for that long game? Or is that just totally naive and unrealistic in the modern market?
I think that's a great question, and one that I can only speculate, but I'll say short-termism is an important part of this, but I actually think it's deadlines and some that we might go from quarterly and let's say biannual or annual. We're still going to have some part where you're going to make or break it. You're going to either get a big bonus or be fired. And inevitably, when we have those, what I call some deadlines, which we inevitably probably will have at some point in time, we're going to create some of that pressure. The challenge also is around what I think of stakeholders, which I think is becoming increasingly complicated as we talk about, you know, a lot of the, I think the interest and excitement of multiple stakeholders, thinking about not just shareholders, but clients, employees, suppliers, consumers, is when we talk about, you know, this notion of doing the right thing, which a lot of code of conducts like to feature this, like, we do the right thing always, some variant of that expression. I sit there, and maybe this is the cynicism that comes if you spend enough time in this area. I sit here with a lot of the people, and it's not always clear what that right thing is, because it's like the right thing to whom? So it's the right thing to not break the law. Okay, if we put that in mirror, but the right thing, if it makes a bit more money, but at the expense of your employees, at the extent of jacking up prices for consumers, I mean, someone is always, this pie is going to be split around these different groups of people. And I don't think we have a great consensus. And I don't think a lot of organizations have really spent the time and care to figure out how they want to prioritize. We want to have this wonderful world and all stakeholders can be equally valued. In the end, every decision is going to value some stakeholder more than the other. And I think rather than pretending we could have this wonderful world and where everyone's equally valued, the old world maybe is not the right one, where it's stakeholders above all else, shareholders above all else. But if we're going to move away from that, I think we need to be very clear, and boards and leaders need to be very clear. What is the trade-offs that we're going to make between, if it's between employees and customers, where does that fall? If it's between employees and clients, where does that fall? We don't have a great guide.
Yeah, I think that concept ties nicely to, you know, I think a topic a lot of companies are talking about when they say things like, we do the right thing always. There's a lot of talk about corporate culture, right? And organizational culture. And you note in your book, Fastow's point that he said, my intentions were good. This is Andy Fastow of Enron. My intentions were good. I was trying to do what was best for Enron, but the way we defined success was incorrect. And as you note, for a long time, and as we've talked about, Fastow was this hero. He was making huge wins for Enron left and right until he wasn't, right? And there's, you know, a lot of scrutiny after the fact about Enron's toxic culture, their lack of transparency, you know, misbehavior all over the place. What cultural elements do you think actually work to set a tone that discourages some of this conduct and instead encourages things like integrity, respect, and fairness?
I'm going to give one simple, I'll say word, I think that seems to describe humility. It's something that very few people in the book have. Well, I'll say they developed humility, but while they were, I'll say, rocking it, they don't. And if you look at a lot of great firms that are being very, very successful, humility is not something that features very high in that list. In fact, the smarter and more successful people become, generally the less humility they have. It's also a function of where they sit in the boardroom. If you're the leader of the company, people look to you for answers. You don't get to really ask people answers. And so how do you get that feedback, that dissonance that maybe your course is off? So great leaders you oftentimes see are people that actually really ask for feedback and are willing to really take that criticism and take it to heart and make changes. I think most of the people in the book could have maybe stopped earlier. Let me put this. There were opportunities to avoid the ultimate significant consequences of their actions or making the mistakes they did, had they been able to create the environment where they had other people actually providing different input and actually being able to actually hear that. Rather, a lot of people surround themselves and create firms where they have effectively clones of themselves in different variants that are giving them exactly what they want to hear, and that's what they want to hear. That's not a great environment to develop, I'll say, either humility or a lot of dissonance.
Yeah, and you know, one of your strongest recommendations is around that notion of humility and how effective sounding boards can be if they kind of the advice is sought from the right people, right? So not just going to your enablers who are going to say yes no matter what you suggest, but maybe those, outside of that immediate circle. So often a spouse is a really good sounding board, or a friend in a totally different sector. And interestingly, you have an example of someone who avoided the fate of, just asking enablers or making gut decisions all the time because they think they're always right. And I'm curious if you want to tell the story of Ben Horowitz and how he avoided a similar fate by having some humility, stopping and using those sounding boards.
It's one of my favorite examples. So to people that have not heard of Ben Horowitz, he's an extraordinary venture capitalist out in California, and a visionary when it comes to technology and innovation. And a number of years ago, he hired a new CFO for one of the companies in his portfolio. And one of the first things that the CFO did was come in and actually look at the stock price packages and the executive compensation packages for executives. And one of the first recommendations she came back to Ben with, the new CFO, was, what other companies in Silicon Valley were doing and what she did at her prior firm was they moved the option date around to maximize the share price. Something I say we now call stock option backdating. If you Google it right now, you'll see a pile of Wall Street Journal articles around this. But at the time, kind of everyone was doing it, especially in Silicon Valley. A number of the big accountancy firms, a couple of the law firms were actually almost promoting this strategy. Ben looked at this. So at the time, though, there was no scrutiny around this, and it was a popular strategy to what Ben immediately thought looked like additional compensation at no additional cost or risk. Ben realized that he was a rock star when it comes to innovation. But when it came to some of these, I'll say, technical accounting and finance concepts, realized that's not where his expertise lie. And so always sought the opinion of someone else that actually this was in their wheelhouse. So someone with a legal or accounting experience. And so he brought this to an attorney who's also a friend and said, take a look at this. And immediately the attorney came back, I've taken a look at this and there's no way that this is within the bounds of the law. I'm not sure how, in their case, their this accounting firm justified it, but I don't recommend going ahead. Ben immediately came back to his CFO and said, you know what? I know everyone else is doing this. I know you did this at your prior firm, but this didn't pass this check I put into place. So even if it takes us a bit more time or money, let's find a different way of going about it. Fast forward a couple of years, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article that attracted the Treasury and the IRS. Moving the option date around without disclosing it appropriately and not paying the associated taxes, it effectively is a tax evasion charge. And so his CFO was actually indicted for the backdating at her prior firm and sentenced to 3 months in prison. And as Ben looks back on this, he says, the only thing that kept me out of jail was some good luck in the right organizational design. And why this example I think is so powerful is Ben is saying what I think a lot of, I'll say, less humble leaders are not willing to say out loud, is that Ben had the same imperfect intuitions as everyone else in Silicon Valley and anywhere else in the country. This didn't strike him moving the option date around as anything egregious. You're not hurting tax paper or preventing little kids from going to school because they don't have as much tax money. This just seemed like this technical change. But realized that his intuitions might not be aligned with what regulators and the public would expect. So he always wanted to get the check of someone else. And it's that check that he put into place and had the humility to understand that stopped him from going down that slippery slope. And so I don't think we like to talk about authenticity and having a true north and ethics and morality is why people would stay out of a book like mine. I think a lot more, or let's say many more examples are much closer to Ben's, of people that just put the right process into place. And while process and internal controls and audit, these are not sexy things to talk about, but it's actually those things that really matter. So to all those, and I'm sure there's some people on the call that do things like audit and process, I'll say you're the rock stars that I think prevent a lot of this. As opposed to authenticity and all that jazzy stuff that leaders like to talk about and are in codes, but I think are frankly pretty cheap talk in many instances.
Yeah, that leads nicely to my next question, which I think you foreshadowed your answer to. In terms of strategies of how to help prevent this stuff from happening, how much faith do you put in some of these, structural modifications, changing, reporting hierarchies and governance models and who ethics and compliance reports to and direct pipelines to the board and hotlines, and what do you see works and is effective, and what do you see could use some more improvement?
So if we think of compliance and ethics broadly as an area, and it's where I spend most of my time, data-driven, really digging in within companies, I'll say the hard part is where I think a divide right now, where we've built up all these structures, post SOX, post Enron. Every firm has a hotline. They have investigative processes. They have a code of conduct. A lot of these things are done in many organizations. They're really what I call check the box. They're all sitting there on paper, but they don't mean a lot in practice. And then there are a lot of firms that actually do spend a lot and really are investing to try to make something of that. And I think what we need to really focus on is measurement. What are we getting in return? How do we actually evaluate whether something's actually delivering an output? So the example, I'll give one simple example. So if people might have watched, I know we have some at least TV watchers that watch movies, but I'm sure many people have seen Mad Men. I would say if you go to marketing like circa 1950s, 1960s, you have a handsome guy like Don Draper come in a polished suit and gives you this snazzy presentation about why this marketing campaign is going to rocket. And they show you some snazzy pictures and then you buy it. And then he comes back 3 months later and tells you how awesome it was. With some vague, generally polished talk, probably over a couple martinis too, if it's in Mad Men. And that was how marketing worked circa 1950s. Today, you look at marketing within firms, no one is buying budgets and spending millions of dollars on campaigns without knowing exactly how that's affecting sales, client retention, turnover, and all these other metrics. What's amazing, I think, about compliance and ethics, it looks a lot like Don Draper 1950s without the martinis, without at least that part of the fun. Where it's all these things, this code, we create these 60-page snazzy looking PDF, polished training with the CEO, giving some high-level thoughts. Does it actually affect anyone? Does it actually change behavior? I'll say for many organizations, I don't think they know. In fact, for example, corporate training, ethics training, the most common metric that is actually used by organization is percent completion. I often have joked in talks that if the dean of Harvard was to evaluate my teaching or any of my colleagues based upon percent completion, that's like the percentage of final exams that I guess I get back at the end of the semester. I guess we all pass with flying colors. I don't even have to do anything. That would be a silly metric. We want to know how engaged are people? What do they learn? What do they take away? What do they remember a year or two later? That's how we should look at ethics training, much like we evaluate professors when it comes to their classes, but we just haven't got that far. And I'll say, I think that's compliance 2.0 is really thinking farther. What are we getting in return and actually rigorously measuring what those benefits are?
And what are you starting to see? You're doing this, you're looking at the data, and what kinds of conclusions can you draw about what's effective, what's not? Different part of the companies have different needs. What lessons have you learned so far?
I will say first, it's realizing that compliance and ethics is not simply a legal function. And this is not to say there's extraordinary legal minds that are doing great work in this area, but getting people to sign a form. So code of conduct, everyone, and I'm sure many people here that work at companies will sign it every year. They attest that they will follow all the rules that are in the code and they will report any violations. We've actually then gone into firms and then asked, in the last year, in the last quarter, have you seen any violations of XYZ type? If so, did you report it? Invariably, only 30 to 45%, depending on what the violation is, of people that see a violation report it, which is a little ironic because they literally signed a legal contract, generally, maybe oftentimes even a week earlier, that said they absolutely would, and they are openly admitting that they're not. And this is not one or two people, this is most, actually. It's actually greater than 50%. And I think that's where we need to start, is everything that we think of as ethics compliance is not simply a legal function that getting people to sign, it's really behavioral. It's the ethical integrity part. And so what we need to think is much more around the psychology and how we actually nudge people. But day to day, and I think the challenge for compliance and ethics in large organizations, I generally think even the best organizations, we don't have the Enrons and the Theranos and then the what I call, perfect companies. The real world is really everyone is operating much more in that in-between gray zone in which if you're at a company with 10,000, 100,000 people, literally every day you're getting allegations of some kind of misconduct, whether we're talking about the bribes and frauds to harassment, discrimination. And it's not whether they happen or not, because it's simply going to happen based upon scale, but it's how they seek to mitigate, prevent, and avoid that reoccurrence. So I like to think of it as there are many small little fires that are occurring all the time, and your goal is to try to make those a little bit less frequent and a little bit smaller fires. The bad companies that mess up, that's when they turn to bonfires that actually become forests that infiltrate, not just their form, but they contaminate the entire industry. This is like the LIBOR scandal. It's every bank engaging in this fraud. And so how can we make firms have smaller little fires and less frequent is really, I think, the challenge of ethics and compliance leadership.
And because a lot of our audience is either students or educators, even a step before the efforts within the companies, and we go back to when people are still in school, you know, I think schools are getting the memo that we need to focus more on ethics and think about ethics in different ways, and you know, provide practical experiences for students to study, to learn from some of these mistakes. You know, but there's criticism that either sometimes these are too philosophical, or that we're setting up totally unrealistic scenarios where we're setting aside, you know, a 75-minute class to talk about an ethics issue. We are telling everyone before the class starts, today we're talking about an ethical issue. And that's one of the very problems, right, in the real world, is they miss the ethical component of it entirely because they're too busy. It's about business, it's keeping up with the competition, and the ethics kind of fades away. And here in school, we're priming them with like flashing lights. Today, this is about ethics. And we have this huge variety of students to give you feedback and provide diversity of viewpoints and experiences. And so it's very not real world when you come down to it. So have you seen, or do you have ideas for like really good ways to teach students who are going to be filling these high level positions in the next couple of years better, to teach, you know, better ways to tackle these ethical cases, you know, that goes along with some of that psychology?
You've nailed, I think, one of the most, I'll say humble, as someone that's a teacher myself, humble is that even a whole semester of time in the classroom is less than your first week on the job. So whatever culture you go into is the one that you're going to be surrounded by. But I think that leads to maybe two observations. The first is, I would say for everyone here that's, you know, when you're graduating, going up for a job, I think everyone has a sense that they are stronger than the surrounding culture. And so they could walk into, you know, Enron or Theranos and like, you know, yourself, and you will be able to confront that and overcome. I think that's what I would go back. That's not a lot of humility. I would say give yourself a couple weeks. You're going to start seeing the world through a different lens or a different kind of worldview. And it might not be one that's going to work out well for you in the longer run. And so thinking very carefully around the cultures that one chooses to surround with. I mean, this is the advice that as now a parent, you think about your child. It's like, if they surround themselves with the wrong kids, that's exactly what they're going to start doing. That's the same thing with grownups. We're all susceptible to that. The second thing is, you know, in all our classes, we're thinking a lot about all our systems and processes, and really, I would say almost raising our awareness. Because a lot of the problems that we face, it's just people are not aware of the challenges they face. And you know, one of the things that's really inspiring over the last couple of years is to actually see how outspoken people have become. This is always true on college campuses, of course, but we see within large corporations, following Me Too, now starting people speaking up, and when they, let's say, let a manager go without termination, or giving them a huge kind of golden parachute as they're leaving, even though they've engaged in egregious conduct. Maybe there were legal reasons they had to do that, but employees are now walking out and speaking up that that's not the kind of culture they want to be surrounded by, and they expect more for leaders at their organization. And I think that's that collective action that can dramatically change the culture within organizations. And something that, you know, the day you begin, you're not the CEO of your firm that has 80,000 employees, and it would be absurd to think that you can change the culture, you know, from the top bottom when you just start the entry-level position. But together with hundreds or thousands of other people, absolutely. This is what management listens to. The single most important resource within the company is its people. I've made a number of comments to regulators and enforcement agencies that, you know, we think $1 billion fine is scary. That's not scary. If you're a firm that makes, you know, billions of dollars a year, paying a couple $100 million fine is kind of a version of a speeding ticket. And you just grow out of that and you make the money back and you move forward. If it affects your human capital, you can't attract the best people at your firm, and the best people don't want to work for you and they want to work for your competitor. That scares, like, you know, the most senior leaders. That's what's really scary. And I think that's something we all can play a part of, about which kind of organizations we want to associate with, buy products from, and be a part of.
I love that inspiring message to end on. As I see we've turned over to time for Q&A, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. So I will turn it over for those of you who have been typing questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much. Ira has been collecting those, and we will let Professor Soltis address some of those now.
Thank you very much. I have some questions that I'm combining and some that are individual. This one, Melanie and I actually spoke about before the program, so I'm glad it'll be in the Q&A. Even when controlling for the number of opportunities, why are most of white-collar criminals men rather than women?
A great question. And I'll say there was a section, I mean, ultimately, I'm very good at writing many pages. This was eight or so pages that ultimately was removed in the final draft. Because I'll say I was hypothesizing, but let me say, I'll describe how I was thinking about this. It's true by almost any way you cut the data. Not just my book. I use he because almost everyone is he in my book. But if you look at almost any stats around white collar criminals, it's overwhelmingly men. And I would say it's disproportionate men, because even if women are still not equally represented by any means at senior levels. But if you say by different accounts, 20%, 25%, 30%, the percent of women that are white collar criminals is like single digits. It's still disproportionately low. So how do we explain that? And I'll say there's, I think, two hypotheses that I have, and I'll say they are only hypotheses. One is looking to like the psychological literature, which actually suggests there's something distinctly different about men and women. So there's a lot of really fascinating work suggests of like all these small things about who pays their the money when they hop onto the bus. Like there's hundreds of studies that suggest that women are just a little bit more ethical than men. And this gets down to like there's some genetic difference that's separating men and women that makes them a little bit more ethical. So that's one potential explanation. The second is that almost all misconduct is committed in groups. And what you want to do is break that group think. I would say that old boys club. To the extent that you have someone that's different. And I would say one dimension is gender, obviously. You have one woman and around three guys, you break up that kind of old boys club and it just prevents it from happening. Now, I would say, I don't know which of these is true, and maybe it's some combination of both of these. What we probably will know, I will go forward in 10, 20, 30 years, hopefully maybe even sooner, when I would say there's more what I call equality. We could then evaluate if it's, we see a lot more women getting in, well, I'll say white collar crime, then we know it's not the, it's not the individual, it's the group think. We'll be able to separate that. Right now, we don't know, but there is a distinct difference, and the he in my book was used quite deliberately because of that.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the next question, which several people have asked about metrics from your data analytics research. Do you find any metrics where there would be a higher than average effective training, ethics messaging, corporate governance techniques? I know you did mention repetitive or retention rates, but I'm sorry about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I'll be honest, I think this probably deserves a longer conversation than a short remark to really go in thoughtfully. But let me put maybe a broader comment that I've been interested by, is that oftentimes within organizations, we think of it as this kind of silo. There's like law, security, talent, HR, and everyone has their own like little domain. All these things are interrelated. So let me give one example that I find really fascinating from the data side, which actually just shows how interrelated, is that what we've actually found that when we have more unsubstantiated HR allegations, so these are discrimination and harassment, we can actually find that 6 to 9 months down the road in that same division plant line, more legal compliance violations. What's a way of thinking about this? Someone raises an allegation, it's not substantiated because let's say the bar for example, something like harassment to legally substantiate is quite high. So the firm doesn't legally substantiate it. Now, to the reporter, that doesn't make them feel any better. In their subjective view, they absolutely were harassed. And it doesn't matter what the official legal standard was. The firm doesn't do anything about it. What, a couple months down the road, what do we see popping up? That person sees that the firm doesn't respect them because they did nothing about that allegation that they raised, that manager's still there doing the same exact thing. So they say, the firm doesn't respect me, I'm not going to respect the firm back. And so the screw gets dropped into the machine. People start showing up late for work. People actually take things home, which is embezzlement. And so a lot of the issues that we think about, people are viewed like very siloed. Let's look at the training data and how that is actually impacting. Let's say we're doing FCPA training. Let's look at how that affects bribery. We're doing HR training to mitigate harassment. Let's look at allegations of harassment. We're really, misconduct is this much more nuanced and I'll say complicated beast that everything is interrelated. So we can actually find when there's more unsubstantiated HR allegations, go forward 9 months in the data, the number of unexpected calls to what I call repairs for machines is higher. Totally different data set. Why? It's because people are not accidentally, they're deliberately breaking things because they see the firm doesn't respect them, so they're breaking things. Those are two wildly different data sets owned by different people in the firm, but it actually goes that we want people to feel respected. We can actually see that they don't feel respected through calling, through machines. So let's go back and actually think about how we can make people feel more respected within the organization through the different processes. I realize that's not exactly the answer to your question, but hopefully expanding almost the question more, thinking about how nuanced and complicated really understanding the impact of all these interventions are within an organization. Oh, I think
I'm unmuted now, correct?
Perfect.
All right. This one is related. And what would make a good metric to for hiring? Can I see a lot of articles and I have my students read them as well. Hiring for character. Is that possible?
So I'll give one, what I think is a great example, but the problem is let's say it's not scalable. So I'm already going to play. So, and I will say, this is JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. I'm actually going to give credit for here. A number of years ago, they actually in their incoming analyst class, they gave a very simple exercise at the end of the week about some basic facts about the firm, the industry, what they were trained on during the course of the week. This was what I call a no pressure quiz. If they failed it, they would simply have to retake it. So not a big deal. The firm gave them at the end of the week the little quiz on their laptop. I should note their company issued laptop and said, take it. The only rule is you can't look up the answers anywhere. You have to use the memory from what we've done over the course of the week. What did I can't remember the exact numbers now. It's on the order between the two firms, a couple dozen people. What did people start doing? Immediately they start Googling the answer. How many employees, what this rule and regulation are. What did Goldman and JP Morgan do the following week? They fired each of those individuals. I will say that's harsh. That is a very called tough love because you get this amazing job at Goldman right after you came out of college and be fired 1 week in because you Googled some seemingly trivial facts is a hard way of learning a lesson. But what they then went back the following week and said is to everyone that was there are oftentimes rules and regulations that you won't understand or not even agree with. They might seem silly. We might as a firm even think they're silly, and that's why we're lobbying to change them. But if we tell you you need to follow this rule or this regulation, we need you to follow it. And so the quiz was a symbolic way of separating that. If you can't follow the rule when we say don't Google, the rule, low pressure environment. So thinking back to the product, this is a pretty low pressure environment and you can't follow the rule then. When you're actually at the end of the quarter and your boss actually maybe pressures you in a little bit more aggressive way, how would you possibly be able to stay within the confines of the rule? So it's one of the more kind of brilliant selection ways of separating people. It's hard to repeat year after year because hopefully people realize that and learn.
Great, thank you very much. I have two related questions from the field of psychology. We invited the psychology departments of various universities. So I'm going to read them both together. It's a kind of a twofer here. noted a reading in your book that you discounted so-called dark personality traits such as narcissism and psychopathy as being major determinants of your interviewees' decisions to engage in fraud, and wanted the person would like some elaboration on that. And another student asks, did you use the Hare psychopathy checklist in looking at the individuals who committed these white-collar crimes to unpack the lack of accountability and other concerning behaviors?
Great question. So first, let me caveat that I am not. I'm an economist by training and a quant by training, so I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Although I'm an academic, so I can read a lot and try to approach it. So everything that I'm going to say, and obviously is written, is caveated around that. So when it comes to, I'll say, I think the question was, I think, thoughtfully framed as I seem to have been discounting that in my book. And I want to be careful that I wasn't trying to discount or separate those or place those any less important. However, what did frustrate me is that oftentimes what I was seeing is it was almost too easy to categorize people in this binary category. They're a psychopath, and as a result, kind of we expected it all along. This person is a narcissist, so we kind of, this is what we expect from them. And it became this very binary way of classifying people, which I think oversimplifies people. The question about the Hare Psychopathy Scale. So I went for the course, so I did go through it. So, you know, actually what was fascinating is the reason I was prompted to take it was actually speaking with Bernie Madoff, who's different than any other individual I've met in my entire life. I mean, I spent a lot of time with him, and he's just different in terms of how he approaches people and his relationships. And I really struggled. I'll say I really struggled with him to really try to understand how he viewed the world. So I was prompted to take, it's like a 3-day-long course. I would say it was anticlimactic. I remember on the day I took it, they gave 3 examples to start the first day of 3 full days of training on scoring individuals. The first case study, and they were knowing these are kind of just high-level cases. The first case was Saddam Hussein. Is a potential psychopath that would rate high in the scale. The second was Jeffrey Dahmer, which people might remember was a serial murder cannibal in Wisconsin. And lo and behold, who was number 3? It was Bernie Madoff. So I'll say I'm not a psychiatrist that can officially by any account use that scale, but what I would say is he was prompted as an example. The hard part is I looked at this scale and I would say my reflection, again, I'm speaking as a quant and individual observer, not as a psychiatrist, is that I look around at a lot of the people that I admire in life, people that are very, very successful. They rate very high on that scale. They're ambitious type A personalities. A lot of the scoring on that scale is around people, if you've engaged in crime and effectively been caught, your score jumps up. So if you haven't been caught, but you are, I'll say, have a lot of psychopathic tendencies or sociopathic tendencies, you're also very high on that scale. And so one of the reasons why I downplayed those in the book is simply because I didn't like this binary classification, because I think it made it too easy to classify someone like Bernie Madoff, where if you read my chapter on him, I'm really trying to thread a needle and really try to dig down farther than a simple classification. But it's a great question. And if anyone has thoughts or critiques around that, please feel free to write. I would love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I think this will be the last question. You had noted that executives need a sounding board, but they're high-powered individuals who need to make split-second decisions. And they have big egos. They may not have the humility you mentioned to have somebody give them a reality check. What recommendations do you have there to convince people to really have that sounding board?
So it's a great question, but I'm going to go a little bit more general on that. It's not just CEOs. I think it's something we all need. I'll say it's what I took away from my work. So if you happen to have a look at the paperback copy of the book, I wrote a new preface, and I called the new preface Why We Do It. Because the more time I spend pondering this, I mean, I'm not in a boardroom. I'm a professor in a business school. So, I mean, most of my decisions don't have the same externalities on people and behavior. But I looked at a lot of the decisions that I saw occurring I did today, even things like speeding. And it's made me reflect a lot more around how we actually make decisions, about how we treat other individuals, how we might cut corners here and there. And I think we all need a sounding board. I mean, I'll say my wife, is someone that I throw a lot of ideas. I have 2 or 3 college roommates that I deeply admire. And I really respect their judgment that I've frequently pass things by when I think they're murky or in some area where I'm not sure right is the right area to approach it. Certainly, I've had actually quite a few of my former students contact me and use me as a sounding board of just someone that you respect, that you can see maybe a different perspective around approaching a topic. And this is not around white collar crime. We're talking about life, the decisions of consequence that are risk, not because they're risk because they're going to break a law or some litigation, but because they're going to be of significant consequence to maybe you or those that you care around you. So that's something I'll say encourage in my final lecture I give in my class, in our exec ed class, where people spend 6 months around one another and meeting this new incredible group of people, is I encourage them to try to find the 2 or 3 people that they met and they discovered during the program that they identify with because they're from a different part of the world or in a different industry, and keep in touch with that individual and use them as sounding board that in 3 or 6 months or 5 years down the road, where they just need someone to say, hey, remember those conversations that we had, X time ago? They can push back and say, come on, that's not that person I remember. That's not how you want to approach. That's not the track or the ambition that you had to pull you back and make you think a little bit differently. So I think we can all relate to that really question, not just CEOs.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to begin the wrap-up process by thanking you so much, Professor Soltis, Eugene, as you've told me I can call you, for taking time out of your day to participate in this program. Yeah, we had 1,000, over 1,100 registrants, and we had in the Zoom room well over about 700 people. And I wanted to let the group know that there will be a recording available within a few weeks. It'll be uploaded to YouTube. Anyone who registered will have a link to the recording. I also wanted to thank Melanie Kay, my colleague, who heads up the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program at Colorado Law, for doing an excellent job leading the discussion. Thank you so much, Melanie. And if you are an attendee that's seeking a CPE continuing education credit, there's 2 hours of ethics credit. I apologize. There's 1 hour of ethics credit for this program. We will have a record of the attendees and how long you attended, and you'll be getting something directly from the chapter of the Colorado chapter of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. So look for that in your email. And thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of the day and evening.
Thank you so much. Pleasure joining everyone tonight.